Welcome, everybody, to the latest fall lecture from the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's Headquarters Incorporated, and the Longfellow House, Washington's Headquarters National Historic Site, as well as our partners at History Cambridge. When the Friends of Longfellow House, as it was originally founded, was created back in the 1990s, one of the reasons was to bring attention to the wonderful archive that was at the house, the papers of the Longfellow family and their friends, and the archive that consists of stuff at the house, the wonderful artifacts, books, artwork, and so much more. Some of those things are on display when you visit the house, but there's also an archive in the basement that not many people know about because it's not on the tour. But it is a wonderful resource, and it is open to the public for people who want to do research or who want to volunteer there. And we at the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's Headquarters, are very pleased to support research in the house and to hear from researchers who are using that resource, as we will tonight. During this tonight's presentation, there will be live captioning. You can find that link in the comments. We ask everybody to please mute themselves because the way we're set up, if you make noise in your house, you will show up on the screen and you may be recorded. And while we're happy to see your face, you may wish to have more privacy. I am now pleased to turn over the microphone to Emily Levine, the Supervisory Park Ranger at Longfellow House, Washington Headquarters, to introduce our presenters tonight. Emily.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight and joining us in virtual community for this installment of our fall lecture series. I'd like to thank John and the Friends of the Longfellow House, as well as History Cambridge, for being just really wonderful partners in this series and so much more. And to John for making this Zoom meeting possible tonight as well. So this evening, as John has said, we have the exciting opportunity to hear from three researchers with diverse interests who have recently utilized this site's extensive archival collection, which is comprised of over 750,000 individual items, ranging from George Washington letters to pamphlets on Soviet theater, and quite a lot in between. This archival material provides context for much of the house's furnishings and other objects in the collection. Park staff, independent scholars, writers, and many others make use of these archives. And in just a moment, I'll put a link in the chat where all of you can learn more about these collections. And I'll also put a link to a new article about the site's digital archives and how you can, from your home, right after this lecture, access thousands of items in our digital archives portal. So tonight we will be hearing from Troy Smith, from Kaila Schwartz, and from Jackie Musacchio in that order. And after each of them have shared a brief presentation on their research, we will have hopefully plenty of time for a question and answer session. So please go ahead and put any questions into the chat that you like. As John said, just a reminder, stay on mute during the presentations. Do be aware that this call is being recorded. So if you choose to keep your camera on, you may appear in that recording and in turn on our YouTube channel. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Troy Smith. Troy Smith is an independent scholar and fundraising consultant based in Brooklyn, New York. His research focuses on philanthropy and Black education in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He received his PhD from New York University in 2020. And Troy Smith, thank you so much for joining us this evening to share a little bit about your research.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. I will try to share my screen and hope for the best to talk about this interesting research. Let's see, what do we see in here?
Yep, we're seeing your presenter view.
Got it. Okay.
There we go. Yep, got your slide.
There we go. So, as Emily mentioned, my research focuses on philanthropy and Black education in historical context, especially the reciprocal relationship amongst philanthropic actors. So my dissertation that I finished a couple of years ago focused on the relationship between a school, Hampton Institute in Virginia, and its donors, who were mostly in the North and white. So this slide of research that I'm talking about tonight focuses on the relationship of those white donors and the beneficiaries, that is the students at schools like Hampton and Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. So although there's been much scholarly attention paid to the relation of philanthropy to the industrial education movement for African Americans during this time period, much that has really focused on the ultra wealthy industrialists like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Rosenwald. And as important as they were, schools like Hampton and Tuskegee were really sustained by relatively small donations from scores of donors, as my research has uncovered, who lived in the North and were white. When these donors gave, they could give specify a use for the funds, just like you might today if you gave money to a nonprofit. So those who designated their gift as a scholarship, which cost $70 to fund education for a year, the school would match them up with a student, and that gave both the donor and the beneficiary, the student, a tangible name to associate with this relationship. And students at Hampton and Tuskegee were required to write thank you notes to their northern benefactors. So here's one, from a 17-year-old from Alabama, 1914, just typical language. I'm not able to express my gratitude for you for the scholarship, which you are paying for me. But I do hope that I should be able to pay it back by the kind of life I lead. So these typical sentiments we find in these letters where they're expressing their gratitude for the ability to get an education from a school like Hampton or Tuskegee. So one can imagine the satisfaction, in this case, George McEnany felt getting this letter, feeling that this was tangible proof that his benevolence was well spent. But what it meant to the students was really unclear. But what's really fascinating about these letters is they're really one of the few the voices of students during this period. A lot has been written in the historiography about Hampton and Tuskegee, but very few from the point of view of the students. So these letters must be understood in the context of unequal power structure. They were written for an audience, of course, not just of donors, but also school officials who read these letters before they went north to the donors. So they can hardly be seen as unvarnished views of the students, but they're still important because it's the voice of the students. So I've uncovered approximately 80 such of these letters between the 1880s and 1920s, the vast majority of them coming from the Longfellow house. So I'm going to talk about some of these letters here. So the schools didn't dictate per se what they should say in these letters, but there's a certain formulaic quality to them where they talk about their background, they talk about their experience at the school, they talk about their future plans. So it was common in a first letter to a donor, Caroline Donor here in 1893, just telling a little bit about her background. And not surprisingly, these students came from trying backgrounds. She wrote, "My father died before I was 3 years old and left my mother a widow with 8 children. 6 years ago, death again entered into our family, and my 3 oldest sisters died within 15 months. Another student wrote to Miss Longfellow that my father is dead and my mother had to work very hard to help send me here. My mother hasn't any property, she rents, she has 4 children, and I haven't any father, so she has to work very hard. Her work is cooking and she gets very little money for her work." So aside from the hardships, obviously, these express, you got to think about what a sacrifice it was for these young adults, 17, 18, 19 years old, to leave home and go to a boarding school like Hampton or Tuskegee, because that really removes them from the household economy. And with these big families and a lot of children and perhaps not a father in the picture, they certainly contributed in the form of labor and perhaps even an income. But in the typical language uplift, these hardships really served as motivation, and they wrote about that. I made up my mind that I would come here to get an education so that in my future life I may do some good for my race, Rebecca Jones wrote in 1888. I felt as though I wanted to be of some service in the world and could not without some preparation. Another student wrote, Courtney Arrington, in 1907. So aside from providing biographical information, these letters served a couple of purposes. One, really showing that the aid was necessary because the student's family was unable to provide. And secondly, that they came from a so-called suitable background. They were industrious, hardworking, and thus deserving of this aid. These gifts were not to be seen as charity to the indignant, but investments in the future. That was the message they were communicating to the donors. They wrote about their prior education, which was varied, but overwhelmingly, let's say the students had an inconsistent educational background with limited local educational options in the South during this time period, family circumstances, like I've talked about, really preventing them from having a proper education. So the chance to go to a school like Hampton or Tuskegee with trained teachers and outstanding facilities was really an opportunity that they relished. Some students really wanted to learn a trade, others just wanted an education. Caroline Wilmer here says, I came here hoping to educate myself so that I may work and teach among my people. Very typical sentiment that I found here. Another here, Maddie Walden. Before I came here, I attended a normal school at my home, but hearing of this school through my teacher, who was a graduate from here, I was very anxious to come. I want to learn a trade any way I can, and I could not do that at home. So having gotten the background out of the way, then they wrote about their experience at the school at Hampton and Tuskegee. And they were showing their northern benefactors, the donors, that they were getting the so-called right education and taking advantage of this opportunity that they were given through these scholarships. So those maybe only casually acquainted with Hampton Tuskegee model of vocational education might be surprised that the curriculum also included the usual academic subjects that you see in this picture. I really like this letter from Emma Ellett to Emily Howland, who lived in New York. She was very descriptive, describing her educational experience. So the first 20 minutes are spent every morning in current events. We have taken special interest in the presidential campaign, the Episcopal Church Convention, and now watching the affairs of the Russo-Japanese War. The next period is English. It goes on to talk about composition, literature. They're studying the talisman. They're studying American history. We started at the Revolution. Goes on and on. I never cared much for arithmetic, therefore I thought I wouldn't like geometry, but I'm glad to say I was disappointed, for it has come to be one of my favorite studies. So almost a familiar quality to some of these letters, and they would keep the same student donor relationship where they could year over year. So I don't know this for sure, but it's possible that Emma Ellett had written to Emily Howland before and thus had some familiarity with each other already. Training future teachers and learning a trade was the primary focus for schools like Hampton and Tuskegee, and these letters really emphasized the details on those aspects. In this letter, Gertrude Allen writes that I'm taking cooking at present, which is a very useful study. It's known throughout the United States that the greater part of the colored races, as she wrote, does not prepare their food properly. It's especially along these lines that I think I can help my people. The trades that the students learned were gendered. Men learned things like blacksmithing and woodworking, while the women learned domestic skills typically. And Courtney Arrington really kind of belied her feelings on this when she wrote that she was interested in agriculture because I have always lived on a farm and I love the farm. And she often wished that I could make a specialty of the study of agriculture and then practice it. But then I think there is little good a woman can do by practicing agriculture. I really wonder what Alice Longfellow thought of that when she read that. The scholarships that they received from these donors only covered tuition, so they still had to cover their board, which meant they had jobs on campus, typically in the laundry room or the dining room. And whatever their true feelings were about having to work on their days off, they hastened to tell their donor that they didn't mind. They even enjoyed the work here. Bertha Costin writing that last year she worked in the laundry. I washed, ironed, boiled, and helped to extract the clothes, and I love to do all of these things. In writing about their work, really, the students were demonstrating for their donor that they were not afraid of hard work and that they're taking responsibility for themselves. When they weren't tending to their academics or their jobs on campus, they had the opportunity to enrich themselves with extracurriculars, typically student clubs. A rare male donor to Miss Longfellow here, who wrote that about his work in the YMCA. The YMCA does missionary work. Young men go out in the country and help the poor by reading the Bible to them, cutting wood in the winter, We sometimes fix up their houses. There are so many things a person may do to help them along. And needless to say, he's talking about going and helping out other African Americans in the community. And then these letters discuss the post-school plans, what they want to do after they graduated from these schools. Many sought teaching jobs, as that was a primary focus of these schools. Some entered trades. There were a few that aimed higher. So here's a sampling of some of these. This Josephine Cleaton wrote that I shall teach next winter if I can get a school, which is, of course, is not a very hard matter for a Hampton graduate. Another in 1908, after I finished my course at Tuskegee, I expect to do a merchant tailor's business at my home in Miami, Florida. Into the 1920s, it wasn't unusual for a student to write that it's my intention to enter college after the completion of this course. Hampton provided essentially an advanced high school education. And in 1926, Thomas Robinson wrote, I want a profession, but I'm a long way off. When I finish, I'm thinking about going to some northern city where I can work and go to night school. So by the late 1920s, Hampton and Tuskegee were both transitioning to full college status, a reflection both of the increased teacher education standards as well as demands by students of overall increased academic standards. So of the 80 odd letters that I've located, I've only been able to find information on the post-school lives, just a few. One went on to Howard, became a well-respected physician, died at age 103. Another became a pipe fitter, died by suicide at age 55. So as a whole, their experiences really represented the breadth of Black life in Jim Crow America. For the vast majority, these thank you letters are likely the only written words of the historical record. And for me, that means they take on such additional importance beyond the role in showing appreciation to their Northern White benefactors. They show that students were not passive recipients of an educational philosophy imposed on them, but they were rather active agents both in the promotion of that philosophy and in the acquisition of their own education. These letters may have been required writing, but their words of gratitude are sincere. For many students had big plans. As one student concluded in 1898, I will thank you again for being so very kind to help me through my struggle, for I am very anxious to get an education and learn a trade so that I may someday be able to go out into the world and help others. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for illuminating these sources for us. And folks, if you do have questions for Troy, please go ahead and if you like, you can pop them into the chat and then we'll have time to get to those a little bit later on. So our next speaker is Kaila Schwartz, and welcome, Kaila. Kaila is a PhD student at Willilam Mary. She holds a BA in history from Brandeis University and a dual MA MLS in history and archives management from Simmons University. Both her senior honors thesis and her MA thesis at Simmons examined changes in the personal naming practice in Massachusetts families from the colonial era to the eve of the Civil War. Her dissertation builds on this earlier work, focusing again on New England families and the use of names as a form of memorialization and a tool for constructing identity. Her general research interests include the social and cultural history of pre-20th century America, historical memory, microhistory, digital humanities, quantitative history, Puritans, and New England history. Welcome, Kaila.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for bearing with me while I get this slideshow queued up.
Looks good.
I'd like to start tonight by thanking the staff at Longfellow House for inviting me to participate in this great discussion tonight and for making my research possible in general. I'm especially grateful to archivist Kate Hansen-Plass for providing me with transcriptions and images of documents from the collections, and to Emily Levine for patiently helping with my many questions as I prepared for our lecture tonight. So thank you. So, as you might guess, I'm going to talk about names, which is the main focus of my research. Names can reveal something about the beliefs of those who bestow them and the cultural moment that they occupy. And part of names' promise lies in their commonality. For quite a lot of people, a name and a rough estimate of when they lived might be the only surviving record we have of them. Names can also offer clues into broader standards and traditions of the time and place where they were assigned. For parents, a child's name could signal where they intended them to fit in and how they hoped to perpetuate the family's legacy. Well-off white parents, like the Longfellows, had to negotiate a balance between high societal expectations and their own personal taste when choosing names for their children, and of course, be mindful that these names would continue to identify them for the rest of their lives. Fanny Longfellow's record of those choices provides us with an opportunity to see how she and her husband navigated the process of making such decisions, and also to consider how her contemporaries might have faced similar experiences. The debate she presents in her letters illustrates just how different their world was, both from that of their ancestors and from ours today. So, a little quick background. Frances Elizabeth Appleton and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who I will refer to throughout as Fanny and Henry, married in 1843 and had 6 children between 1844 and 1855. This was slightly higher than average for families of similar background in mid-19th century Massachusetts, giving them even more opportunities to bestow names than some of their friends and neighbors, to my benefit, of course. Their children's names were, as you can see here, Charles Appleton, Ernest Wadsworth, Fanny, Alice Mary, Edith, and Anne Allegra. But how did they settle on these names? Maybe you've thought about this process before for your own children, for those of your loved ones. Maybe you've heard stories about your own name. I've been studying names, as you might guess from my introduction, for a very long time. I'm currently writing my dissertation on New England naming from the 17th century to the 19th. Tonight, I'd like to focus on a passage from a letter that Fanny Longfellow wrote to her dear friend Emmeline Austin Wadsworth following the birth of her first daughter in 1847, highlighting the challenges the Longfellows faced in finding the right name for her, which I've framed around a series of questions. This case illuminates some of the Longfellows' name choices for their other children as well, and situates them in the context of antebellum Massachusetts. So first, who was responsible for deciding on a name in this time and place? We are not yet quite satisfied to call her Fanny, she wrote, showing the equal voice that both parents had in the selection process. By the middle of the 19th century, white women in New England had much more influence over the names their children received than they had in preceding centuries. While she reported that Henry generally settles upon calling her Fanny, she wasn't sure yet if that was the right choice. Fanny may have had more influence than her husband over the choice of the name, in fact, by saying that Henry had first proposed more romantic ones. Fanny reveals her own veto power. They ultimately did not decide to use one of those romantic names this time, although they would eventually use some of Henry's suggestions for later daughters, Edith and Alice. Fanny, in this case, wanted her daughter to have a family name. But was there pressure in general to pick a family name? The Longfellows seem to have favored family names. This might reflect Fanny's preference more than Henry's. 5 of their 6 children shared at least one of their given names with another relative, as you can see highlighted here. And their leading choice in this particular case, Fanny, was also Mrs. Longfellow's name, which fits securely within existing Massachusetts naming traditions. Although the practice of naming a child in each family for their parents was declining by the 1840s, it had a long history of support. Fanny had a younger half-brother named for her father and a sister, Mary, whose name was similar to their mother's. Henry's father, Stephen, was the 5th of that name in his family, and Henry's brother and nephew also had the same name. So Fanny's hesitance to name this daughter after herself may speak to beliefs about appropriate female modesty. She may not have believed that she was a worthy namesake, despite Henry's opinion. Instead, Fanny had hoped, she said, to call her Mariah after my mother, who had died 13 years before. Bestowing the names of the dead served as reminders of earlier generations, linking children to their ancestral past and working to ensure that the memory of beloved older relatives would live on. The couple's first son, Charles Appleton, had been named for Fanny's brother, who had recently died. Henry himself bore the name of his mother's brother, Henry Wadsworth, who died prior to his birth. And this phenomenon was not unique to the Longfellow family by any means. Even as naming children for their parents grew less frequent, Massachusetts families continued to pass on the names of other relatives, including those of siblings who died in childhood. Names then could preserve a visible record of the family over the years. However, Fanny also noted some challenges to recycling family names by this point. In the middle of the 19th century, tastes were changing. Earlier generations of parents had focused mainly on the character of a namesake, but now parents worried whether or not a name sounded too peculiar and biblical, as Fanny noted, for her mother-in-law's name, Zilpah. Names drawn from the Old Testament, once the bread and butter of New England communities, had begun to lose favor as too old-fashioned. In their place, romantic names, popularized by contemporary literature, gained popularity. Their prevalence in historical novels gave them an air of tradition, despite the lack of family and community precedent. But what did parents think about other people's opinions? Although she doesn't explicitly say so in the letter, by musing at length on the names she and Henry were considering, Fanny was inviting Emmeline to comment on their selections. Unfortunately, Emmeline's correspondence does not survive, so we have no record of what she thought of Fanny's musings. And on other occasions, Fanny wrote to members of her family and Henry's, asking their opinion on names that they were considering. Parents might have played the most central role in deciding what names their children would have, but they relied on others too. Was the meaning of a name or how it sounded more important? As the relationship between names and moral imperatives shifted, parents increasingly based their choices on personal taste. For some, including the Longfellows, what a name sounded like mattered. Was it pleasing to say and pleasant to hear? Fanny acknowledged that even the most ordinary becomes winning by association, but consideration of a name's melody still affected their decision. They rejected Maria for their little girl because they didn't like the name much and they didn't associate it particularly with her. Earlier generations of New Englanders had used names to evoke desirable characteristics, expecting that their children would grow into the name's positive connotations. Now the name itself mattered more. Did parents care if the name was popular? Who else held the name still mattered, but in a different way than it had previously? In the past, extended families might include more than one child of the same namesake, especially girls. This practice created many same-name cousins, strengthening ties between them, even if they didn't share a surname. Fewer boys had same-name paternal cousins, particularly those who lived nearby, because of the confusion that would result from having multiple men of the same age with the same name in the same town. But for the Longfellows, one namesake was enough. By noting that she already had a little cousin so called after her, Fanny expressed her relief that she didn't bear sole responsibility for preserving her mother's name. She and Henry had been in a similar situation when choosing a name for their second son. Since Henry already had a namesake nephew, ensuring that his name would live on, they decided to call their son Ernest, which they liked better. This emphasis on the name itself could even supersede the desire to honor a beloved and worthy person. Previously, parents considered if the namesake would make a good role model for their child, whether that namesake was a relative or friend, a biblical character, a political figure, or a literary hero. Most people knew more than one person with the same name, so a single disreputable person could not ruin a name entirely. But for the Longfellows, the fact that their friend Jane Norton had a dog named Mira rendered it entirely unacceptable as a name for their own daughter, despite the fact that Fanny's mother had used it as a pen name. Ultimately, Fanny and Henry did decide to name this little girl Fanny. Their choice echoed that of countless other Massachusetts families, passing names down from one generation to the next. But their debate also reveals just how much what was considered a good name had changed between the colonial era and the 19th century. Biblical names faded as others took their place. Changing tastes shaped the use of family names. And beneath it all, the reasons for choosing a name remained complex. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating, and I'm sure that everybody on here is eager to learn more. So folks, once again, feel free to put any questions that you have for either Troy or Kaila into the chat, and I am pleased to introduce our next and last scholar this evening. Jackie Musacchio is a professor of Italian Renaissance and Baroque art at Wellesley College. Her scholarship has focused on the intersection of female experience and material culture from the Renaissance to the early 20th century. Her current book projects examine the women artists who traveled from the United States to Italy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including several friends of the Longfellows, among them sculptors Anne Whitney and Florence Freeman, the painter and Dante scholar Sarah Freeman Clarke, and the illustrator and translator Francesca Alexander. And Jackie, thank you so much for being with us this evening. All right, we can see your.
Sorry.
Oh, there you go. Now we hear you too. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Emily. I'm really pleased to be here today to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Longfellow House. I'm a relative newcomer to Longfellow studies. I spent the first part of my career, as Emily mentioned, as a specialist in the Italian Renaissance, with that focus on women and material culture. But several years ago, I shifted that focus, and I've been working on a series of articles and 2 book projects that examine a group of these late 19th century women, and particularly these women artists who traveled from the United States to Italy. In my research, I found constant references to the Longfellows, who knew most of these women and socialized with them, either in Boston or in Italy when they traveled, when the Longfellows traveled there. You've been looking at a photograph of the Longfellow family when they were in Venice in 1869. I was really fortunate to begin this work pre-pandemic. So I've had the experience of sitting in Longfellow House basement, reading diaries and letters written by some of its former occupants, which is such an evocative sort of thing to do. And I had the great assistance of the archivist, Kate Hansen-Plass, in that work. Kate expertly tracked down what I needed, despite the fact that I never really had proper citations for it and only had random references. And I'm so grateful that she continued to do that for me as well after the pandemic hit, when in-person research was impossible. So I hope my talk today will give you a sense of the different threads of my research and the possibilities of art historical research at Longfellow House itself. So part of my research investigates the friendship between Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Sarah Freeman Clarke. Clarke was part of the transcendentalist community around Boston, as well as a remarkable circle of female intellectuals, among them the journalist Margaret Fuller and the educator Elizabeth Peabody. She was a talented artist, as well as an expert on the 14th century poet Dante, at a time when few women could really make either claim. When in Italy in the 1860s and 70s, she traveled to the sites associated with Dante and with his Divine Comedy, and she documented her journey with text and pen and ink drawings, like this one of the pine forest at Ravenna. Her efforts were recognized by her contemporaries as the artistic equivalents of the acclaimed translations by her friends Longfellow and Charles Eliot Norton. However, unlike them, she literally walked in the footsteps of Dante, a complicated and at times arduous undertaking, particularly for a woman at that time. And Clarke was over 60 years old when she began her journey, and particularly given the difficulties of travel during this period. She sold some of her drawings and also displayed what must have been a fabulous, but now lost, large album of them at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial. And she hoped to publish an illustrated book about her journey with these drawings. And she sent the completed manuscript of that book to Longfellow and to George Washington Green for their approval. Indication, I think, of her position in Boston's great Dante circles. Green praised her, writing in a letter, "I feel very proud at seeing this beautiful tribute to the great Florentine from the pen and pencil of an American." Longfellow was also very complimentary and offered to speak to a publisher on her behalf, and she sent him this drawing to thank him. But Clarke is just one of the women I examine who interacted with Longfellow in some way. Another was the Boston-born sculptor Florence Freeman, here in a photograph taken in Rome in the early 1860s. Freeman is little known today, but she was right at the center of the Anglo-American community in Rome during her lifetime. She traveled to Italy first in 1861 at the age of 25 and basically remained there for the rest of her life. She was one of several women sculptors associated with the American actress Charlotte Cushman, either as lovers, friends, or recipients of financial support. And these other women included Margaret Foley, Harriet Hosner, Edmonia Lewis, Emma Stebbins, and Anne Whitney, all slightly more familiar names than Freeman herself. Of course, many Americans were less interested in the art that these women produced and more interested in critiquing their behavior, which went so much against societal expectations for women at this time. Henry James, who knew some of them, dismissively called them a strange sisterhood of American lady sculptors who at one time settled upon the 7 hills of Rome in a white Marmorian flock. My research on Freeman led me again to Longfellow House because until recently, the only known sculpture by Freeman was there. And that's this marble bust of the Archangel Sandalphon, popularized by Longfellow's 1858 eponymous poem. In January 1870, a group of prominent Bostonians gifted the bust to Longfellow. This note explains that Longfellow's admirers and Freeman's friends were all connected, a group that included members of important families like the Welds, the Russells, the Greens, and the Bigelows, as well as Longfellow's brother-in-law, Thomas Gould Appleton. Despite her success, Freeman suffered from increasingly poor health while she was in Rome, and after what was described as a case of consumption, she died in Rome in 1883 and was buried in the non-Catholic cemetery there, which some of you may know. Some of her possessions made it back to her family in Boston. Her brothers, in fact, donated 8 plaster casts of famous works of art that had been in her Roman studio to the Museum of Fine Arts. Contemporary sources mention more sculptures by Freeman, but I've only located 2 others so far, making her Sandalphon particularly important. Women artists like Florence Freeman also intrigued their contemporaries due to the popularity of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Marble Faun, an 1860 novel about contemporary life in Rome. Travelers read that book to prepare for their journeys, and they brought it with them to use as a guidebook, or they bought copies of it while they were in Italy. It contains extended descriptions of famous sites, famous monuments, famous works of art. So it really becomes a kind of fictionalized guidebook. Travelers did the same with George Eliot's Romola, her 1863 novel about life in Renaissance Florence. So these travelers, or in some cases the shopkeepers who sold these novels in Italy, would also insert anywhere from 1 to well over 100 photographs into the otherwise unillustrated novels. These novels were then fitted with decorative end papers and bound and painted and tooled parchment or vellum. You see 2 copies of these extra illustrated novels here, a Marble Faun on the left with a Romulus and Remus on it, and a Romola on the right with a fleur-de-lis. Doing this, extra illustrating these novels, could take a great deal of time and effort. And for that reason, the sculptor Anne Whitney, who lived in Rome for several years in the 1860s and 70s, was very dismissive of this practice, although she knew many who made these extra illustrated volumes when they were in Rome. In fact, in a letter to her sister, she wrote, "Mr. Longfellow made one and pasted the photographs himself." I wanted to find out which Mr. Longfellow did this while the family was in Italy, and if the volume actually survived. And Longfellow House does indeed have an extra illustrated 2-volume copy of Hawthorne's Marble Faun, presumably the copy that Whitney knew and saw. There's no ownership inscription in it, but a February 1869 entry in a diary kept by Henry's daughter Alice states, "Uncle Sam's Marble Faun, illustrated by photos, came back from the binders." So this was Samuel Longfellow's novel, and he pasted over 100 photographs into it. Some are common and reference the text itself, like the Dying Gaul that you see here from the Capitoline Museum. But many others were unusual and sometimes even hard to identify, like the painting that he cut to fit around the chapter heading that you see over on the other side. Samuel's vellum-bound and gilt-ornamented 2-volume set with marbled end papers that you can maybe just see on the edge here is the most elaborately extra illustrated copy that I've examined so far. Perhaps motivated by her uncle, a few months later, Alice assembled her own extra illustrated 2-volume Romola with 51 photographs. And this too is also at Longfellow House, to my great excitement. It was bound after the family returned home rather than in Italy, and has been rebound since. So you're looking at the left on the original binding, probably from a Boston bookbinder, and a photo of Florence pasted on the last page of the volume on the right. According to Alice's diary, when the family was in Florence in May 1869, she was, quote, suddenly inspired to illustrate Romola. So after tea, went to 2 shops to get the book, but all the copies were sold, which was rather a blow. Alice eventually bought the novel, as well as many photographs, which she talks about in her diary. Some were quite unusual, but others, like this view of Florence, were key to the text and much more common to many other Romola, extra illustrated copies of Romola. I was also absolutely thrilled to find that Alice's novel also includes a handwritten and apparently unpublished poem about her extra illustrated Romola. The verses of this poem praise Alice's efforts and describe the photographs and their placement as a fitting celebration of the city of Florence. The handwriting remains unidentified, but it is not Alice's. It may in fact resemble her father's in some ways. In its vivid description, the poem does have some similarities to Longfellow's 1878 poem Keramos, about the travels of a fictional potter. But this poem seems to be more personal, perhaps jotted down on a train or steamship during the journey home, as father and daughter page through her efforts. Alice also pasted a photograph of John Gibson's marble Psyche and the Zephyrs of 1822 at the end of the poem, which is what you're seeing there on the right. There is no connection between the poem and the sculpture, or indeed between the novel and the sculpture. Rather, it seems that Alice saw the sculpture in Rome, where there was a copy of it, purchased a photograph of it, and pasted it into the novel to personalize her copy even further. These are just 3 examples of the sort of research I've been able to do at Longfellow House for my larger project about Americans in late 19th century Italy. It's been a huge pleasure working with these resources, and I'm really looking forward to returning to that basement in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing these incredible sources with us and your research. So I'd like to kick us off with some questions. Thank you once again to all of our researchers. And thank you as well. I think this has been mentioned a few times, but I want to shout out Longfellow House archivist Kate Hansen-Plass, who has directly supported so much of the research that we've just learned about and is responsible for so much of the extensive digital archival resources and stewardship of this collection. So with that in mind, I'd love to invite the 3 of you just to speak briefly about the experience of researching a little bit more in the Longfellow House archives. And sort of in addition to what you've chatted about tonight, did any of you come across any particularly memorable or any particularly surprising pieces? And Jackie, Kaila, Troy, any of you can jump in.
I'll jump in. I've never been to Longfellow House. All of my research was done virtually, and I had wanted to when I was doing my dissertation research. I was kind of aware that there were some papers there at Longfellow that were of interest to me, but I just never got a chance. I got close. I got over to Harvard's archives, but never quite made it over to Longfellow House. So after I finished my dissertation, and nobody was going anywhere for a while in 2020. It was really serendipitous that Kate and her crew really started digitizing this, because she got back in touch with me and said that she was working with this stuff, and it was really great. I think I identified some of these thank you letters throughout my research and dissertation, but they were scattered kind of here and there in archives. So it really makes me reflect on how obviously historians were kind of stuck with what gets preserved a lot of times in archives, who chooses to preserve things, how things get preserved, but also how things get organized in the archives. And by far the most letters I found of this nature were in the Alice Longfellow collection, and they were organized in a very systematically in this way as thank you letters, which just brought new life to this line of research for me. So I think aside from the immense gratitude to Kate and her staff for being able to do this, I think one of the things, I don't know if it surprised me, but pleased me really was really bringing these students to life through these letters. And so often, if anybody is familiar with this historiography, and there's no reason any of you would, but students are often treated kind of as passive actors in this drama that was going on between W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and industrial education versus classical education. The students really are just not part of that historical debate, and a lot of that's because they're not in the written record. And so this was an opportunity to really try to put these students into the historical story that so much has been written about.
Thank you. And
I can, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, folks can, feel free to jump in on that question. John Bell just put maybe a little bit more of an intriguing twist on it, which is what are the biggest mysteries or questions you'd love to find an archival answer to?
I can jump in here and say, I'd really like to know who wrote the poem that I just showed you in the back of the Romola, or the front of the Romola. That to me, having the reference to the Anne Whitney letter and then just saying to Kate, do you have this book? And her walking down to the basement and handing me the book was such a great thrill. And then finding out, going through trying to figure out who did it, and then finding the diary, and then seeing that Alice made a Romola and saying to Kate, do you have a Romola? And yes, Kate had a Romola too. That kind of thing is tremendously exciting. And to work, as I said at the start, to work in the actual basement of the house where these people lived, instead of in a library or a modern building, some kind of archive or institution, but to be working there is just so incredibly evocative. And you really get a great sense of the people and their things from that. So I feel very lucky that I was able to do my work there.
Great. And Chris in the chat is encouraging running that poem by Jeff Haas, folks, who has just published Longfellow's Imaginative Engagement. Wonderful.
So I guess I'll jump in here too and say that, like Troy, I have never been to the Longfellow house, sadly. Hearing Jackie describe it now, I really want to go there.
Really sorry, I didn't mean to brag.
No, it's fine. It sounds wonderful. You're talking it up. Get them more people coming in. I'm sure they'll appreciate that. But yes, so Kate was incredibly helpful in sending me things that I otherwise would not have had access to quite easily, it would seem. Probably not easy on her end, but she made it seem easy during the pandemic when so many institutions were closed and no one was there to actually digitize things. And so it took a lot longer for other places to be able to make things available. So I was lucky in that respect. A lot of what I do is like searching for needles in haystacks. Finding places where people talk about what they decided to name their children requires a lot of background knowledge. It really helps to know approximately when the children were born. Otherwise, you're just looking at decades and decades and decades of diaries and letters, hoping that someone mentions something. And to find this letter in particular, and some of Fanny's other letters as well, was just like a moment. Most people are not nearly this effusive when they do describe the process of naming their children. Sometimes they'll give a reason why they picked a particular name, but it's very rare for them to show all of the names that they considered and then rejected. So I kind of want to know why, and Fanny does describe the names of her other children to some extent, but she's never as effusive as in this moment. And so if I could go back in time, I'd love to ask, like, why this one child gets such a debate and the others just don't. Yeah.
Thank you. If you find out, let us know. So okay, let's stay on for a moment. There's a question for you from Rebecca. Do you think the shift in naming patterns you notice reflects a larger societal trend in New England in how people thought about their families, elevation of personal tastes versus signaling belonging to a particular community?
Great, thank you so much for that question. I think there are definitely some shifts going on in this time period. I think part of it is related to community and how people are seeing where they fit. I think there's also a broader community shift. So there's definitely more emphasis on personal tastes for the Longfellows, and greater discussion of romantic names in particular, but they're not alone in that. A lot of other New England families are also making this shift away from names that they consider too peculiar and biblical, to names that are less difficult to pronounce, for one thing, and maybe sound a little bit more flowery. So there is sort of this element of, yes, they're less compelled to pick a name just because it's a tradition, but there is also a sense of they are creating a new tradition. And in the case of Alice, which is a letter that I did not put up on screen, but there's when she's born and they discuss naming her Alice. So we have this instance where Henry has proposed a name because it is romantic. But they also sort of go looking in the family tree to find Alice's so that they can say that they are also naming her for a relative. And they do, and Fanny mentions a couple of people, one on her side and one on Henry's, in the either who are more distant cousins in the present or were a relative from the more distant past, so that they can say that, yes, it is a romantic name and we like it, but it is also a family name too. So there's sort of this blending of tradition and sort of giving a foundation to things that might otherwise be considered new.
It's really fascinating. Thank you so much. There's a question from Emily Wells for Troy. Could you speak more to the broader context of your research? Are you looking at other letters and objects written or made by students to thank benefactors, or are you focusing on this particular school?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The true answer is I'm still figuring it out a little bit, how this fits into my larger research. This really was the first post-dissertation line of research that I've pursued. And as I mentioned, that my dissertation focused really on the relationship of Hampton, specifically to its donors. And part of my argument, very technocratic, but one of the reasons Hampton was so successful at raising money is they had good fundraising practices, and I'm a fundraiser by trade, and so I kind of have that perspective on things. And and they did a lot of right things, like having their students write thank you letters to their donors, because it helped those donors, put a name to, they lived in New York or Boston or wherever. And Hampton was in Virginia, 1,000 miles away. Most of these donors never visited Hampton. So how do you create that kind of personal connection that would want to make them feel connected and incidentally give gifts year after year, which they did. So as I was writing my dissertation, I remember talking to my advisor about this, Dr. Frazier. I said, I'm really kind of disturbed that I'm writing this dissertation about Black education and there's no Black voices in my dissertation. Because Hampton's principal was white, most of its top officials were white, the donors were white Northerners. So I'm writing about Black education, and it's only really white voices in my dissertation. And my advisor said, don't worry about that, just finish your dissertation. That dissertation needs to get done. You can worry about that after you get done with your dissertation and write your book. So so coming across these letters really has been able to encourage, to help me think about how I can fit these voices into my overall story about the industrial education movement. And so Hampton and Tuskegee fit into this, but there's a lot of other smaller schools, most of which don't exist anymore, that kind of fit into this. And I have found some letters, but so like I said, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how I'll work this into my larger project. But like I said, just being able to give some character and voice to these people who are really central to this story about Black education, but nothing is written from their perspective. Throughout the reams and reams of historiography that's been written about this topic. So stay tuned.
Great, thank you, and some appreciation for that in the chat. We should have time for about 1 or 2 more quick questions. So feel free to put those in the chat, or just come on off mute and ask a question if you got one. We'll give folks a moment or two.
This is Lauren speaking.
Hi, Laura. Yes.
I was gonna, oh, sorry. This is a question for Kaila. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but did you ever find out why you're named Kaila? Did you ever think about that or ask anybody?
That is an excellent question. As many projects start at home, you have to, I more often get the question of how did I get into names, and it is very much about family. I know that my parents considered other names first. I know that, like the Longfellows, they decided that the name they had first picked out did not particularly fit me. I didn't look like an Alice. I was supposed to be Allison. I did not look like an Allison, apparently, whatever an Allison looks like. So then they went back to the drawing board to pick something else, and they wanted a name that people could not shorten. So they made me Kaila with an I instead of Kaila with a Y. However, people will say that you can't avoid K by getting rid of the Y because it's still a first initial. So some people will just give you the initial as a name. But in any case, it does really point to that question with this project of it does start at home. The basis of my project is mostly quantitative rather than qualitative. The Longfellows are great for helping me look at the great mass of names of people who didn't leave any other records. And from that, I can sort of start to figure out some of the reasons why they may have made the choices that they did. So just knowing these little bits really helps me inform what I can say about that larger population.
Cool. Thank you, Kaila.
Take one more question if anybody's feeling brave. Question for Jackie from Holly. Wondering if you can share what prompted your shift in period of study and the challenges and rewards of working on both eras. And that'll be our last question for tonight.
Thanks for the question. I think I look at women in the Italian Renaissance and women in the 19th and early 20th century in very similar ways. I'm interested in their lives and the objects associated with them, the material culture that surrounded them. And so it was sort of a natural shift. It also came about because I encountered a painting at the job I used to have at Wellesley College that was painted by a woman, and turned out she was friends with all of these people, and it kind of just kept pushing me along. And I've really enjoyed it. And I have to say, contrary to the research I do, which I still do on the Italian Renaissance, this is research I can do in this country, which certainly has an advantage in recent years when travel is so much more difficult. And what I have been completely overwhelmed by is the wealth of information I can find for this era as well. I've always done archival work and I love archival work, but in the Italian Renaissance, you usually have this much archival work you can do and nothing else really survives. In this topic, I seem to have way too much information in some cases. And if I'm having a day where I can't quite think or make my way through some horrible handwriting, I can go search through newspaper archives. You know, there's so much information out there for the topic I've been working on that I find it tremendously exciting. I do want to go back to the Renaissance eventually, but I feel like I've got so much to do with this topic and with these women who are so little known, but absolutely intrepid and fascinating, that I've enjoyed working on it so much that I think I'll stay in the 19th century for a while longer.
Great, thank you. I think that's a wonderful reflection on the excitement of archives and 19th century archives and archival work to go out on. So I'd like to thank our presenters once again, Troy Smith, Kaila Schwartz, and Jackie Musacchio. The recording of this will be available shortly on the Longfellow House YouTube channel. Some great kudos going on in the chat as well. For folks who are local, we have a few spots still left next week to join us for our penultimate lecture of the 2022 Fall Lecture Series. series, that will be National Park Service archaeologist Joel Dukes, talking about a dig that went on here on site earlier this summer. So go ahead and register for that if you'd like to come on out next week. Otherwise, thank you all so much. Thanks again to John with the Friends of the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, and to all of you for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful night and a wonderful weekend. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.